Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Reef Builders ReefStock at Home. This is episode 9. I'm Jeremy, your host, and thanks for joining us again. We've got an interesting show this month. This time we're doing tips for beginners. So basically, this is my favourite part of the hobby, by the way. This is where complete newbies come up to you and say, "I think I want to keep marines," and I'm like, okay, we can do this. Don't be put off. Anyone can keep marines. You don't have to have kept tropical fish before. Anyone can do this. Anyone can do reef keeping. We're in a better time than we ever have been. So this episode suits me perfectly, and we've got a few tips from a few experts as well. Firstly, we've got Than from Tidal Gardens in Ohio. Now, this guy is a coral farmer. So he grows coral for a living. So there's nothing that he doesn't know about how to keep and grow corals. So I'm really pleased to have him join us for this episode. And he's going to be going through everything from, just the fundamentals. So you want to keep a reef tank, right? You're going to need good light. You're going to need good flow. You're going to need to manage your water chemistry, right through to things like, photographing corals. Corals these days look amazing due to blue LED light and orange filters, and you can make them really pop and look really fluorescent. But he's kind of going, but sometimes you'll think that the coral that you're buying online is different to the one that you received, when actually it's the same, it's just under different light. So kind of managing your kind of expectations for your neon colors there, but also just about the internet and what he's learned over, I think he said 30 years of reef keeping, especially, being online and being on the forums over those decades, is, just take things with a pinch of salt. There are lots of different ways to succeed with reefing. And he's kind of saying, well, look, I'd go for the guy with the good tank who can demonstrate that he knows what he's doing, as opposed to the guys who kind of talk a lot and don't have a tank to kind of show it off. So that's really interesting. And I look forward to giving it a watch. Now, the next one is going to be me. So this is what I do. Tomorrow, I'm going to be in um, a reef store advising people on how to keep fish. They're going to come through the door as they usually do, and they're going to say, I want to keep marines. So I'm going to take you through what I advise people on a daily and weekly basis, everything from tank size to, testing, the importance of testing, why you should test the water, which test kits you should get, to, livestock, what livestock you should avoid, clownfish, the most famous marine fish of all. And then we're rejoined by Fran and Jodie from Coral Reef Queens. They're the two Yorkshire lasses who I visited in episode 8, and they're going to be talking us through dipping corals, placement of corals, and just everyday kind of issues that they've come up against and have to deal with, things like flatworms. So it's going to be an interesting show, and let's start with Than from Tidal Gardens.
What's up, guys? Welcome to Tidal Gardens. So if you're unfamiliar, Tidal Gardens is a coral farm located here in Copley, Ohio. We've been doing this now since maybe about 2002, but we recently built this new addition. So the topic of today is some beginner tips. I haven't really been a beginner for quite some time, but I can tell you guys that especially now, it can be really overwhelming to jump into this hobby. There's more information than ever, and when you see elaborate setups like this, it can even be more intimidating. So the first bit of advice that I can give you guys is to try to simplify the process as much as possible. For example, you really only need to worry about good lighting, good flow, and good water chemistry. Now, the devil is in the details because there's a million different ways to accomplish those three things. But I promise you, if you do accomplish those three things, you're going to be just fine. I think when starting out, there's so many options now to accomplish those three different goals that it can be really overwhelming, and there's a lot of opinions out there as to how to best go about them. I honestly wouldn't even worry about it so much, because if you try to approach those three goals with literally the simplest way possible, you're gonna be fine. It's only when you get into the more elaborate things that they're intended to make your life easier. But as far as like your actual aquarium goes, you're all striving for the same thing. So I'll be very specific. If you have a lot of stony corals, like this tank, for example, it's got a lot of Favia, Favites, it's got some Cyphastria, a mix of fast and slow growing stony corals. Now, we have to provide some source of calcium and alkalinity. There's a lot of ways to go about this. If we did a lot of water changes frequently, that would work. So right off the bat, you guys, you didn't even need to buy any pieces of equipment. You just have to keep up on your water changes. It's only when you get into like super fast growing stony corals that you really have to worry about additional supplementation. Over there, we do two additional things to kind of keep up with the demands of this tank. We do a calcium reactor, and we also do 2-part dosing. Now, for a beginner to jump into this thinking, okay, well, I wanted to keep stony corals, I have to do these other things. I have to get all this other technology. Chances are you really don't. If you just have like a few stony corals, if you just keep up on your water changes, there's a really good chance that you're going to be just fine chemically. But you might not get that impression looking at all the different tanks online that are kind of like these aspirational systems that have every bit of technology associated with their construction. We make the investments into technology here just to cut down on like labor costs and to make things a lot more smooth. But for a home aquarium, you really don't need to worry about investing in the crazy pieces of equipment. Similarly with lighting, there are definitely some high-end brands out there. We use a high-end brand here. These are Radion Pros. You could be successful with a lot less. It really depends on what you're looking to do more than anything, but even if you just had money for an inexpensive T5 fixture on Amazon, it's going to work just fine. If you had just enough money for those quote-unquote Chinese black boxes on Amazon, like a Vipar Spectra, it's going to be just fine. It's only really when you're looking for something super specific, or there's something that those lights aren't giving you that you want. At that point, a higher end lighting fixture might work out better, but there is a lot of hype associated in this hobby, and if you're just looking for baseline success, you can get there on a budget. Okay, the third thing that I'll mention is, especially now with the internet, with social media, with the access to a lot of information, you're going to hear a lot of conflicting information. And what's even more confusing about that is both perspectives might actually be true. And the differences are really in the nuance. So I can imagine for a beginner that would be a very confusing thing to dive into when you're hearing seemingly diametrically opposed viewpoints on a specific issue. I can kind of simplify that to some degree for you. The really nice thing about the internet is people show their aquariums. I refer to it as the calling card. What is your calling card? Because that will speak a lot more than the text by itself, right? So if the really loud personality online has a system that you're not particularly impressed with or that you don't aspire to, you might want to weigh that into what they're saying. versus if somebody has a phenomenal system that you just absolutely fallen in love with, and they're kind of going through step by step as to how they got there. You might want to give that a little bit more weight. And I have to say that when it comes to like just loud personalities online, you kind of have to have that filter, because I've been in this game for about mid 30 years or so. I started when I was about 8 years old. I'm really old now. It's about 30 something years. And the folks that are from like my generation of hobbyists, a lot of them really aren't into the mood to share information. And it's not because they're hoarding info. It's that they've gone through the online wars for the past 20 some odd years, and they really don't have any more appetite to have these discussions. They know what works, and they're comfy with just hanging out with their own home aquariums. So again, take everybody's opinions, a little pinch of salt, and check their calling card. Okay guys, next tip. Learn how to shoot. There are two enormous benefits to learning how to shoot these aquariums. The first and foremost thing is, just for your own personal edification, having that resource of past photos really helps. Because one of the things that is very, very, very late to develop in beginning hobbyists is observation. And that is easily the most important skill to be long-term successful, is to constantly be looking for problems in your own home aquarium. And what's really nice about having a catalog of past images of your same aquarium, like our brains, they're really not great memory storage devices. We get confused as to what we've seen, and our memory just tries to piece together something that may or may not have even been real. Case in point, one of my friends had a red Goniopora, and I thought it was like the coolest coral. And I remember everything about this red Goni. And when I saw him next, I was like, hey, do you still have that red Goniopora? And he was like, no, I never had a red Goni. It was a green Goni. I'm like, interesting, because I distinctly remember it was red. And he showed me a picture of his tank, and sure enough, it was a green Goniopora. But in my brain, for some reason, it's colored red. So anyway, that's kind of an extreme example. But if you just have like this diary, this visual diary of your tank, if you think that, maybe this coral's not really growing, there's something wrong with it, and then you check past photos, and sure enough, it's doubled in size. It just grew slowly, so you didn't kind of notice it. You can check progress that way. You can check to see if there's problems. Maybe it is shrunken and not growing. And that coincided with some kind of methodology that you had changed. So first and foremost, it's kind of like I said, this visual diary / journal of your tank. Super helpful. The other thing is, you will learn how difficult it is to take photos in this tank. And because of that, you'll kind of get more savvy to the different techniques in order to get certain appearances on a camera. And this is super helpful when it comes to shopping, especially shopping online. Because of 2020, a lot more people are shopping for corals online. And right now I have to say that it is the most challenging time to shop for corals because of how much manipulation happens in the wholesaling coral process. Like, we try to give people as much info as possible. We try to shoot under different types of lighting, for example, 10K versus actinic. We do YouTube live shows where we actually show a transition from a very daylight look to a very actinic look. But even then, what we represent on camera, you might even have a difficult time reproducing in your home aquarium just based on your lighting choices and whatnot. It gets even more complicated when somebody doesn't have a great camera, because a great camera can really compensate for a lot of the blue light. That's really the issue here. Like, these cameras don't like blue. So what happens is, if they don't have a great camera, what they can do is use like a like an amber or a yellow filter to cut that out. And it gives like this very orange cast to the image. What that does is that you do get to see kind of a more true representation of the fluorescence at the cost of everything kind of looking that orange color. So you kind of have to mentally discount that, and that can be a challenge for somebody that's not too familiar with it, because I guarantee a lot of what you see online, especially on like Instagram and stuff like that, if you saw that tank in person, it probably is not going to look like that. There's so much going into both the filters and the post-processing, all of that stuff to get that image. It's drifting further and further and further away from what you might actually see in person. And even with some of our suppliers, like I know how they go about editing their photos. So I know that when I see that particular coral looking super crazy on their site, I might have to dial it down a little bit mentally, because it's probably not going to look like that once I get it into my possession. It's just one of those things right now. All right, guys, that's it from here. Hopefully some of these tips and tricks were helpful to you beginners out there. Happy reefing.
So that's the kind of facility that gets me a bit kind of excited. I work in a wholesale coral facility, and just even things like I'm looking at, what lights is he using, what frame is he using, and look how tidy it is, and he's got drains in the floor, and all these kind of things, because this is how you do corals on a commercial basis. But the fundamentals are the same for when you keep corals at home. He's talking about stability, good lighting, good water flow. This is how you do it. The oceans are so stable, and it's all about, he's saying use light, use flow. You can start with a budget light and you can succeed with a budget light. You just need to kind of manage your expectations. You're not going to keep aquapora without having to do dosing, but water changes just, I'm a massive fan of water changes, and they forgive a multitude of sins. And just by changing the water, you can, reduce nutrients, you can add buffers, you can aid water parameters. So, my advice to everyone and fans as well is, change water. It makes a huge difference, and it makes the hobby a lot easier. So on the subject of that, we've got kind of, the Than's gone over the kind of fundamentals of what you need, but the first stage for me when even thinking about a reef tank and advising on people on getting into reefing is what tank do you actually want to choose. So think about what you want to aim for. Do you want the dream? Do you want a huge hole in the wall tank with loads of hard corals and hundreds of fish all swirling in an amazing colorful mass? You can have that, but that's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take a huge learning curve, and it's going to take a lot of work by you. Even if you have someone to help you set up and maintain that tank, you're still going to have to be the eyes every day. You're still going to have to do some monitoring, and then does the tank need to be that size? So what fish do you actually want? You could start off with a small tank, something like a Red Sea Max Nano, a 75-litre nano tank. It's got a good light, it's got a protein skimmer, it's got enough water flow. So if you just want corals, and that could be special corals, it could be chalice and gold torch. You don't have to have them in a huge tank. You can start in a small tank like a nano. The governing factor is going to be what fish you want, because if you want a fish like a tang, like a regal tang or a yellow tang, then you're going to need a much larger tank. So it's actually about the fish, not so much the corals, that will kind of make up your mind as to what tank size you want to go for. Obviously, larger tanks are more stable, but they cost more money. They cost more money to light, to equip, to aquascape, and to stock. So the first thing I do is I say to people, what size tank do you want to go for? Do you want to start small and maybe remain small, or maybe step up in a couple of years' time? Or do you want to go for the dream? Because if you want to go straight for the dream, you're going to have deep pockets. So that's the first thing I'd have a think about. What fish do you want? If you want tangs, go big. If you're just a coral person, you don't have to go big. You can have a really stunning tank in a small space, and the fundamentals are all the same. So the next thing is testing. I highly recommend to people that they invest in their own test kits. You'd be amazed how many people I deal with who've got great reef tanks, but who don't test the water, who bring their water samples into an LFS and they get people like me to test it. That's great. I know what I'm doing and I can advise you what to do. But you need to be able to test your own water and understand how your tank's working. You need to know what your salinity is, what your KH is, what your calcium, magnesium, nitrate, and phosphate levels are. Because then by knowing your tank, you can know how quickly those levels go down and what you need to do to remedy them if they go out of kilter. So test kits, yes, they cost money, but once you've got a couple of £1,000 worth of corals in your tank, it all makes perfect sense, and you don't even have to buy them all at once. I mean, the first thing I'd go for is just a refractometer. We've got a new series called Reefology, and Jake was going through how to mix salt. And he uses a digital refractometer. He explained the difference between specific gravity and salinity and the level that he keeps it at. And I'm the same. Now, I use a refractometer like that one there. Not a digital one, but an accurate one. Nevertheless, it cost me about £40 in the UK. But that is fundamental to my reef keeping, because by having an accurate knowledge of the salt level, I can maintain that salt level just like in the ocean, because stability is key. And then from that salinity, I can help to deduce that other things will be okay and in balance as well. So as an example, if your water is not salty enough, so if your specific gravity is say 1.023 instead of say 1.025, and your salinity is 33 parts instead of 35 parts per thousand, it just means that you're going to have less of everything, not just sodium chloride. You're going to have less calcium, you're going to have less magnesium, less potassium, and these things are important to corals. So what you may find then is that if you don't know your salinity is too low, you'll be chasing numbers. You'll be adding buffers to buffer calcium and magnesium levels, when actually they could have been in the salt. All you needed to do was raise that salt level, measure it accurately with a refractometer, and those levels will be naturally higher, and your chemical balance, your water parameters will be more suitable for corals over a longer period. So get the salt right first of all. And if anyone's ever having problems with their reef tank, that they'll come into the store and they'll say my corals aren't opening, the first thing I check is the salinity and the specific gravity, because it makes a difference. So just as an example, I run mine at quite high, probably 35 to 35.5 parts per thousand, which is about 1.0 up to about 1.026 on the refractometer. So that's how I do it, and it works for me. And if it's too low for people, I advise them to raise it slightly, and that's just by doing a water change and adding slightly saltier water than you did before. The next test kit I go for is a KH test kit, because KH is the first thing that will drop once you start adding corals. It's called carbonate hardness, also known as alkalinity. And out of all of the 5 tests that I mentioned, KH, calcium, magnesium, nitrate, and phosphate, KH is the one that drops the most rapidly and needs buffering. Now, as Van said, you could change water and that will help to raise your KH. But if you've got a lot of hard corals, you need to buffer it either with a calcium reactor or with a 1 part, a 2 part, or even a 3 part buffering solution. So test the KH, and I would test the KH more so than the calcium and magnesium, especially in a new aquarium. Magnesium is quite high and it takes quite a long time for corals to degrade that. Same with calcium, but KH can drop on a daily basis. And so what I do is I test my KH and I write it down. I'll maybe set up a spreadsheet on my computer, and the next day I'll test it, and if it's dropped, I'll add some buffer and I'll add say 5 ml of KH solution, and then I'll test the KH again and I'll write down what it went up to. So if it dropped to say 7.5 and I added 5 ml of KH solution and it brings it up to 8, I know that my aquarium is using 5 mils of KH buffer per day. Why is that important? Well, it's important firstly for stability. So then I now know how much I've got to add to maintain a stable KH of 8, which is great for corals. But also it means that I can then set up an auto doser and program that doser to auto dose 5 ml of liquid KH buffer for me per day. So then it's automated. I can set it and forget it. I don't have to worry about it, and it's going to help to maintain a steady KH. And a steady KH is key to a successful reef tank. So that's a good one. And liquid test kits, here's mine, dead easy to use. Some people are daunted by test kits. Again, if you can drive a car, if you can fill out a form, if you can log into a computer, you can use a liquid test kit. Dead easy. And the last test kit that's important is phosphate. So phosphate, as we know, it causes algae. If it's too high, it can retard coral growth. So phosphate, as a general rule, we want to keep it as low as it possibly can be. So we test the phosphate and we use a number of different phosphate management solutions to lower that phosphate. So those are my tips for the 3 tests. I'd go for a decent refractometer, a liquid KH test kit, and a phosphate kit. And if you're testing those and you know what the results of those are, then you're well on the way to being a successful reef keeper. So livestock, the exciting part. This is what I see everyone rush into. So you set up a reef tank and you bring your family into the store and you're like, right, this is it. I want the dream. I want Nemo, I want Dory, I want, a yellow tang, I want a starfish, I want, everything. And most of that is possible, but the first thing we need to do is slow it down. So that tank needs time to mature. We can use bacteria, we can use old mature live rock, we can use Cheeto, which is going to help to kind of iron out some of the potential ammonia and different things like that in the aquarium. But we just need to stock it slowly. And the first fish that's recommended by me as well is a clownfish. Now, clownfish are, you know, Nemo, they're clownfish, they live in anemones. They're the most popular fish in the aquarium hobby, and they're responsible for bringing loads of people into the hobby, and that's a good thing. Even better is that most of them are now available tank bred. So that means they're not taken out of the oceans and they're very sustainable. They're actually also quite easy to keep. But the biggest mistake people make with clownfish is the number of clownfish that they want to keep in a tank. So whether your tank is 2 feet long or 6 feet long, the maximum number of clownfish that I recommend that you have in that tank is 2. Lots of people try having 2 different pairs in there. Some succeed, but most of them not long term, including myself. And the biggest mistake I see people make on a weekly basis is adding more than 1 pair of clownfish per reef tank. They inevitably fight. They may even kill each other. And so I recommend that you just go with 2 clownfish. You can mix the colors of different perch varieties. You can go for, you know, 1 gladiator, 1 Picasso, 1 frostbite, 1 storm, 1 black, 1 orange. You can mix them, and they're not fussy either. So they will kind of, you know, an orange clown will pair off with a black clown, no problem. But what you can't do is add new clowns to a reef tank with an existing pair, because they won't take to them. They'll be aggressive. They'll try and kill them. They'll take chunks out of them. It's going to be stressful for you. You're going to have to try and catch that new pair of clowns and take them back to the store. So 1 pair of clownfish is my biggest tip, really. And so many people, I know we want lots of different pairs and lots of different varieties, especially don't mix, you know, common clowns or perculator clowns with aggressive clowns like maroon clowns. Maroon clowns will kill them. Maroon clowns are really tough fish. They get to 5 inches long. They're good for fish only tanks. They're good for larger reef tanks, but they're aggressive fish, so don't keep them with percolators. Same goes for, you know, Clark's clowns and tomato clowns. And when you see tank bred clownfish in the store, they're quite small, and there's normally 20 or 30 in a tank, and they're tiny. If you can, go for the larger ones in there, or go for some of the larger tank bred clowns in a different tank, because when they're larger, they're easier to feed. They can put up with other fish better, stress more easily, and they are more suited to, you know, the high water flow that you get in an average reef tank. If you start with 2 tiny clownfish, they've just come out of the hatchery, you need to feed them often. They're like babies, they're fragile. So I recommend that you go for 1 pair of tank bred clowns, but get a larger pair if you can, and it will pay dividends. And lastly, it's, you know, my advice on other fish and compatibility. And back to tangs, everyone wants lots of different tangs, a yellow tang, a regal tang, you know, if you've got the budget, something expensive like a gem tang, you know, an Achilles tang. But mixing tangs is where reef tank fish compatibility gets difficult, because although many of these tanks shoal in the wild, in an aquarium, even a large aquarium, they become very territorial with each other. So my advice is, if you can, just stick to 1 tang in the tank, or mix different tangs from different genera. So mix a yellow tang with a regal tang, with, you know, a powder blue, as opposed to 2 acanthurus species like a powder blue and an Achilles, because they're very similar. They're most likely to fight. The same with the Zebrasoma tangs. You know, lots of people want a yellow tang, a purple tang, and a gem tang. That's really difficult to mix them, because they're cousins effectively. They compete for the same territory, the same food, the same feeding niches, and that's when it gets difficult. So my advice to you, if you want multiple tangs, have 1 from each different genus, as opposed to several Zebrasoma tangs or acanthurus tangs, because that's when mixing fish gets difficult. So have a think about that. And we're on to corals now. Back to the coral reef queens with Jodie and Fran, who we featured in episode 8. So they've got this lovely little tank, and you know, I am fond of it. It's got loads of euphilia in it, and as you saw in the last episode, lots of colourful LPS. But it's a small tank; anyone could do it. And you know, this, if I was a beginner, this would inspire me to want to keep marines and corals. So back to Fran and Jodie, and this time they're going to talk about how to dip their corals, because recently they've had an outbreak of flatworms.
Hi, we're Fran and Jodie and we're the Coral Reef Queens. On two important elements for beginners to keep a successful reef tank. We're going to focus on, firstly, keeping corals in a fish tank. What's the important bits? And that is focusing on dipping your corals, making sure that you're not putting any nasty critters into it, and also rock structure and the coral placement. We'll go into this into detail now. When venturing into marines, if you're a beginner and you start going into corals, what you will find is that even corals that you purchase from the best fish shops or from people in the hobby, is you will at one point come across bad critters in your tank. And by bad critters I mean flatworms, sundial snails, any bugs that will eat any corals or irritate them to the point that your corals won't come out and they won't thrive. What any new hobbyist needs to purchase is a coral dipping solution. It's great, it helps get rid of all the bugs off your corals, and it also helps as an antiseptic. These can be purchased from anywhere. I'll show you a video in a moment of how to do them. Once you dip your corals, you need to keep them quarantined away from your other corals. In my case, I had a flatworm infestation. I didn't do that. I put it with all my other corals. And then I've had a massive outbreak of flatworms, which I'm now fighting to get rid of. So quarantining your corals away from others is really important. So with coral dipping, don't be frightened to use any that are on the market that's cheap as possible for you. I've found that every kind of coral dip that I've used has the same effect. It works as an antibacterial and it removes pests from the tank. At the moment I'm using a weaker version. This is a torch that I've been dipping that's got some damage. It had a really bad infestation of flatworms. So just tip that in, like so. You want to give it a little stir. And what you're looking for over the next few moments, I tend to leave my corals in this dip for about 10 to 15 minutes, is any creatures coming off the coral itself. Flatworms are notorious for getting in and amongst the polyps. So what you want to be doing is very gently using a pipette below the polyps, and that'll help any flatworms that might be hiding inside to come out. And what this coral dip does is it doesn't damage the coral itself, it helps make the critters and the bad stuff jump off the coral. And if you've got an infestation like I did, which I'll put a video up shortly, you'll see the amount of flatworms that actually came off it. What you are not to be alarmed about is seeing any amphipods and copepods coming off it. That's totally normal. But I tend to, if I've had an infestation of flatworms, dip it every 5 days for around 15 days. So this is on its third dip now.
This was a torch coral 15 days ago when we first dipped it. As you can see, there are lots of dead flatworms. These have badly damaged the torch head itself.
So this is 15 minutes later. As you can see, the polyps are very retracted now. It doesn't look happy, but that's only temporary. In the pot itself, there is no creatures that have come off it, no flatworms. So I'm quite happy to put that back in my tank. It's been in isolation away from other corals to stop it infecting any. Yes, that's as simple as coral dipping is. Just make sure that all the time that it's in there, you've got very gentle flow going, just to help along the polyps. But don't be blasting it, because the last thing you want is to damage the polyps inside the skeleton as it's retracted. Another important aspect for beginners, and something that I wish I'd known 13 years ago when I first started in the reefing world, is rock placement. Rock placement will be one of the biggest things that you learn when you start up a tank. I used to just chuck rock in and hope for the best, and what you don't want is dead spots. So in this tank at the moment, I've got areas around here and here for the pump to flow all the way around, so I have no dead spots where rubbish and waste can collect, because that's the worst thing that can happen. You can then get an ammonia spike and a nitrate spike if you've got detritus waste gathering at the back and not getting enough flow around it. But it's also highly important to plan where you're putting your rock. So I used to take quite a long amount of time now putting pieces of rock and actually picturing where I'm going to put my corals. So in respects of euphilia, some euphilia can go together. So you can have your hammers and you can have your frog spawns together, and torch corals come into the euphilia bracket. However, if you put a torch coral next to either of these, it's going to kill it. They're really aggressive, the torch corals. So I've got my torch corals hidden away in the top corner, along with the bottom one which we've just dipped that's not looking very happy at the moment, and another one. But they've all got their own space so that they're not stinging anything. I've then got a big hammer coral with various different kinds and some frog spawns, and they're quite adjustable to the flow. They don't mind where they go. But then you have the less demanding flow corals, such as your scollies and your trachyphilias and lobophilias, and they're all on the sand bed. But what you need to also allow is plenty of space to allow for coral warfare. So the issue that you might have is that this lobo and trachyphilia are quite close together. As they grow, there's a good tendency that they might sting one another. So you need to be really thinking about where you place your corals. As I say, this tank at the moment is quite full. As these grow, I'm going to have to decide where I move things. But in terms of my hammers and frog spawns, they're all fine, they can be placed together. But the sandbed corals, as they grow, are going to get more and more aggressive and attack one another. Along with placement of corals, you also have to be very careful of the light. I don't keep very much SPS corals, so I tend to focus on the LPS. So the lower light demanding corals, I would always aim for mid-range to the bottom of the sandbed. Your higher demanding corals, such as your torches and your hammers, which are quite adjustable, they can go higher up. I've got a couple of SPS corals up there that are getting quite a lot of flow and quite a lot of light because that's what they need. But your lobophilias, your scollies and your trachyphilias, they all are quite adjustable to lower lighting ranges, so I tend to put them on the sandbed. This is something that I wasn't aware of when I first started reefing. I would put sandbed corals up in my rocks because I thought they looked nice, and they didn't thrive. They were getting blasted by flow, they got too much light, and then what you get is a retraction of the coral itself and it eventually dies.
So thanks again to Fran and Jodie, the Coral Reef Queens. Check them out on Instagram. It was interesting about the euphilia because that's another great beginner's tip. So euphilia can be very broadly divided up into frog spawns and hammers and torch. And although people talk about euphilia gardens, torch are aggressive and hammers and frog spawns aren't. So hammers and frog spawns can go together in the same euphyllia garden, but torches can't. So top tip from Jodie and Fran, and dip your corals, and like they kind of alluded to, everyone gets pests. A lot of these corals, especially euphyllia, they're cultured, they come from Indonesia, and they may come in with pests, and they may get to the wholesaler and they'll be dipped, but it doesn't catch every pest, and they'll go to a retailer and they may dip them, but you still need to dip them as well, because these things, as they showed in the video, they can kind of tuck themselves away in the flesh. So even if they've been dipped previously, I recommend dipping them again. And as they said, if you can quarantine them in another tank, even better. And I know that Jake is a massive fan of quarantine and healthy corals. So thanks again to Jodie and Fran, the coral reef queens, and we hope to see you soon in the next episode of ReefStock at Home. So ReefStock at Home came about due to the pandemic, and ReefStock is actually a show. It's a great big show that you can visit, and you can talk about all things reef, and you can see everything that you could possibly imagine to do with reefing as a hobbyist. It's actually an international show, if you didn't know. It's taking place in Denver. It also takes place in Australia. But we'd really like to know, where in the world would you like ReefStock to come? Do you crave a Reef Builders ReefStock show? Do you want it on your doorstep? Would you travel to it? Would you want it in Europe? Would you want it in the UK? Would you want it in Asia? Let us know where you want to see ReefStock, and let's see if we can make it happen. Okay, and the Reef Builders digital platforms are growing. Obviously, Reef Builders has got a hugely popular YouTube channel, but it's getting even bigger because we're now joining it with the highly popular Reef Therapy, which I recommend. I listen to it myself, Jake and Mark chewing the fat on all things reef, and it completely resonates with me. I'm a similar age, similar level of years in the hobby, and just reverting back to things back in the day versus now, that's a great thing for me. So please do check out Reef Therapy. It's now got its own YouTube channel. Check the link below. But also ReefStock at Home, the platform that we're on now, is also going to get its own YouTube channel. So that's going to be 3 ways to enjoy and be entertained by the Reef Builders brand. So we're going to have the Reef Builders YouTube channel, the Reef Therapy YouTube channel, and ReefStock. So it just keeps getting better. Thanks again. So that just about wraps up another episode of ReefStock at Home. I've been Jeremy, your host. Thanks for joining me again. If you've got any ideas, comments, suggestions, please send them through. We'd love to have your input on it. And again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you